a professor at Cambridge, who I think will be speaking to you in another session later in this series. Ricardo Sabates, a reader at the Faculty of Education. And then two of our three research partners in India, Willem Wadwa and Suman Bhattacharjee, who are leaders of ASA, or Pratham. I'm not sure if you've heard of either of those groups. Pratham is probably the largest, I think it is the largest educational NGO based in India. ASA is one of the largest research institutes. It's closely tied to Pratham. I'll be speaking about them in a little bit more detail as we go through the session. And then finally, not pictured is Rukmini Banerjee. Rukmini works with Willema and Suman. She is the CEO of Pratham, this educational NGO. And a lot of the work that I'll be presenting today was actually initiated by Rukmini over the last 10, 12 years. Could I just get a show of hands, please? How many of you have heard of before of either Assam or Pratham? Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of the, I should just say that, one minute, if it's okay with you, typically the way, my preference for a seminar is that if you have any thoughts, questions, clarifications, opinions, do feel free to raise your hand, jump in at any point. Otherwise, I'll try to keep it to about 50 minutes so we can speak at the end. But it's always a bit more engaging, I find, if people do actually jump in as the time arises. But in terms of the structure of this session today, the first thing I just want to do was to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of a story about where this particular research is coming from, the key principles that are guiding our work. Secondly, to try and give you some details of the intervention, although the fact is that we haven't actually decided exactly what the intervention is going to be yet. But so again, some thoughts from you will be very interesting. But I will tell you at least what we've come up with so far and how things are shaping up. And then thirdly, I was just going to touch very briefly upon the initial parts of the research design. Although it should be said that things aren't much more detailed than this particular chalkboard here. That's what we spent 3 or 4 days working on, and that's what we have so far in terms of a research design. So in terms of the background to this, I think if I just had to summarize this in one sentence or so, it would be that assessments have played a very, very important part in education globally in helping us to think more about the quality of education and whether children are actually learning when they're spending time in school. But I think what the focus of our particular research team is the idea that assessments are not only important in telling us whether children are learning, but they can also serve a very important function actually helping children to learn. And I'm hoping what I'm saying now will become a little more apparent, a little bit clearer as I work through this session. So, sort of a little bit of a background, a little bit of storytelling. I'm not sure how many times you've heard this, but this is a very common story, at least in Cambridge, when we teach on education and comparative and global education. But one of the shifts when we look at global education policy over the last 10 to 15 years has been away from the major focus for many, many years, which was the idea that we should be getting more children in school and children should be spending more and more time in school. And as Lance Pritchett, a professor at Harvard, has made very, very clear in much of his research, we've been very successful over the last years or the last decades at making sure that more and more children are getting into school and they're spending more and more years in school. If you compare the 1950s through to about 2010, you're seeing around about a 5-year increase in the average number of years in schooling, both amongst higher income countries and also lower income countries, to such an extent that by 2010, the average child in a lower income country was actually getting more years of schooling than a child in a high income country in the 1950s. Of course, the gap has still maintained. But as Lance and many other researchers have made clear, that was very much the focus of education policy for years, if not decades, getting bums in seats, getting more and more people into school. But of course, getting children into school doesn't necessarily mean that they're also learning. And so that's been, I would say, the major shift in the last 5 to 10 years. Pauline Rose, one of my colleagues on this project, who will be speaking to you in a few weeks, she led one of the global monitoring reports to come out of UNESCO. And one of the key focuses of one of Pauline's reports was the idea that if we just look at many, many of the children globally, there are about 650 million children of primary school age in the world. But actually almost 40%, 2/5 of these children aren't learning the basics. And it's not simply because children are out of school or because they haven't managed to complete the primary school years. That's a major problem. Around about 20% or so, if you like, of children have this, are in this particular, face this particular challenge. But it's also the case that around the world, about 130 million children have completed 5 or more years of schooling, and they still haven't learned very, very basic numeracy or literacy skills. And that's very much the focus of this research team and what we're trying to tackle, which is basic foundational literacy and numeracy in the primary school years. And this sort of alarm about learning rates, I think, at least in my opinion, when you see it in the media, it tends to focus in what I sort of think of almost as like a World Cup of learning, which is different nations and who's coming out on top, who's doing the best. PISA, I would say, tends to be the one that gets the most headlines. Which country is doing better than another? And this is just one example from a UK newspaper, which of course takes the United Kingdom and immediately worries about which countries are just a few steps ahead in terms of maths or learning, in terms of maths outcomes or literacy outcomes. I would say this is a very misguided approach to think in terms of nation states, because it's very important, I would say, to remember that within any single one of these countries you've got tremendous inequalities. It's not enough to speak about an average or a particular country's learning conditions. You have to think about the most marginalised children in any one country. And just to try and sort of demonstrate this, if you compare in a number of countries the gap in the percentage of children as to whether or not they're able to do basic division sums, if you compare the poorest quintile to the richest quintile in each of these countries, there's about a 20 percentage point gap. So quite a sizable gap, just on one dimension of inequality. But as you add more and more dimensions of inequality, things get worse and worse. So if you compare the poorest to the richest, there's a 20-point gap. But in rural India, if you compare the poorest girls to the richest boys, that gap goes up to about 25 percentage points. If you compare the poorest girls whose mothers never went to primary school to the richest boys whose mothers did go to primary school, that gap suddenly increases to about 40 percentage points. And then if you compare the most, according to these dimensions, the most disadvantaged children in the worst performing regions to the most advantaged children in the highest performing regions, the gap increases so much that you've got some children who are almost guaranteed to be learning the basics in division, and other children who, according to their background, have next to no chance whatsoever. So the key, I think, really is to focus on not just on particular countries, but on the most disadvantaged children in a particular context. But I've just thrown in loads and loads of statistics at you about, these sort of claims about millions and millions of children. And I think it's very important to just stop and take stock of how do we actually know any of this? As researchers, we ask these kind of questions, we throw these kind of numbers around, but on what basis do we actually make these kind of claims? And perhaps more specifically, when we make these claims about whether children are learning, how do we actually know? So what I just want to do at this point was to take a quick break from me just lecturing you, to actually get your thoughts on the particular assessment tools that we're using globally. So what I've given you here is a handout, and it's 3 pages. Each of these pages gives you just a taster of 3 of the major learning assessments that are used globally. And I just wanted you, please, just to take a couple of minutes, just first of all to have a read through by yourselves, and just to think about these 2 main questions. If you think about each of these assessments, so it's 2 pages per assessment. What are the implications for each of these assessments? Firstly, for the way that we actually collect information on whether children are learning. And secondly, how we actually analyse whether or not children are learning. Okay, please take a minute now just to share your thoughts with the person or the people that are sitting next to you.
choose the volunteers that conduct the ASR test in the community?
They look for a partner in the given district, so that's often typically a university or a teaching college, and often they will have their students as volunteers.
Okay.
And then they'll go out.
Okay.
So ASA will train leaders at the state level, and those will be sort of staff from ASA, but those staff will then work with a particular university or teaching college at the district level. Okay.
It really does depend on the that is like
So if I'm understanding right, you're suggesting that the volunteer giving the test may try to stop the student because they think it will be.
There's still definitely scope for judgment in terms of how you compare that to that.
I guess
Quite a general rule is to ask the child to recognize 75 numbers.
Something about very specific context about
And these numbers are like the stuff on the previous test from one of the actual languages from that sound. They are different settings. No, neither do I. But the one on the previous page, identify different sounds or something. Might have been different. And anything on you start with the things that they learn in first grade or the things they learn in third grade.
Yeah, no, I'm totally learning assessment.
Okay, if I could just get your attention again, please. Okay, okay. Some initial thoughts, please. What do you think? 3 different assessments, quite different to one another. What were your thoughts on each of them? Yeah.
So we were talking about the mathematics test, for instance, and about the way that those numbers are treated quite clinically in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So before we were talking about like different forms of knowledge and about a study that actually showed that the students might not have the concept of numbers in a way that is reflected in those assessment, but for instance when they work at a tailor and their like family context, they are well aware of how to measure certain things. So I guess we were just talking about the way in which this assessment is set out in the first place, and that it might as well not be able to collect data that indicates the potential knowledge that those children have. So that's a very like kind of European pen and paper based model of assessment. So that's kind of what we thought about this.
That's interesting. So actually, ASA, this research team that we're working with, has just released a national report in India, which has been very, very contentious, because for the first time they've been looking at skills of 16 to 18-year-olds and trying to look at what they would consider more practical skills. So rather than can you do a division, are you able to read and understand how to use a medicine packet? Or are you able to understand very, very simple sort of purchasing between a bulk purchase of food or purchasing items individually? And they were... Yes, and that, I think that gets a very, very interesting thing, such as sort of what you might call applied math knowledge versus what you're seeing in these, which is arguably much more abstract, perhaps more academic. And what do you mean by clinical?
Just in the way in which the numbers, for instance, the idea of some number recognition, subtraction, division, and the way just in which this is used is something that's obviously familiar to, you know, our framework and my context, for instance. But if you, for instance, don't either have teachers who are well aware of this context and struggle in the first place by transmitting this sort of knowledge, or if you have a very different concept about how to understand numbers because you've been actually practically applying this in a very different educational setting, more informal educational setting, it's just I think it's just the fact that these math test examples do not reflect any other possibility. So with subtraction, for instance, if they had put it in the context of maybe telling a story about what do these numbers actually represent, to probably trigger different forms of understanding that go beyond looking at a number. So that's what I mean by clinical.
Clinical, yeah, in the sense it's not like
Yeah.
real life context, it's not a real life problem, so it's something like, clinical in that sense.
Okay, thank you. And just to be clear, are we talking about this particular maths test, or are we talking about this one which asks you to do a fraction and
I would say
or to read a graph?
it's good.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Any other major thoughts on these? Yes.
Just on the ACER reading sample test. One sort of classic thing about reading tests that ask you to read single words is that there's not necessarily any proof of comprehension. And similarly with the sentences, the short paragraph and then the longer paragraph, even if a child were able to read those sentences aloud, unless you actually talk to them about the meaning of the story, you have no idea whether they've understood what they've just read or not.
Yes.
So I don't know if it's not clear from this, it doesn't include anything about actually asking them what it means.
You're right. So this one doesn't include comprehension, which has been sort of a major criticism of it.
Literally kind of
It's literally your ability to read phonetically. Yeah.
I think we were talking about in terms of the collection, it was quite difficult to know what a mistake was. So if a child makes a mistake and then corrects it, do they still get the mark? Or at what point, like pronunciation, or all sorts of things. So I think as well as that idea of knowing comprehension, even in the phonetics, what is a mistake and what isn't a mistake is a little bit...
Yeah. Oops.
We'll probably cover all of this, but of course, first of all, the big contention is the purposes for which these assessments are used, and as we know from the aggregates being misused, which is a problem because it was developed as a diagnostic tool for the assessment of children's potential for learning.
Yeah.
So the one, whatever this is, the letters, of course, is part of a suite of 8 or 9 different diagnostics whether children have sufficient skill at the age of 7 or 8 to become leaders. And of course, as we know, RTI is developing assessments. It's become such an industry, they're now being applied not to 6 or 7-year-olds, but to 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds in different country contexts, and that's a big problem.
Definitely.
ASA, as we know, is, first of all, there's a problem with its logic, in that you go from letter to word and word to sentence. And so in terms of its administration, what it tries to do, of course, is to mimic a logic that is inherent in an educational system, which is a learning progression. Because learning doesn't occur, at one occurrence, and teachers who've been assessing or trying to understand children as learners would have an understanding of a learning progression and how they go from, 1 or 2 skills to more, and how different skills translate into other skills. And of course, for ASA, of course, the issue was never to, and I think again there's a big misunderstanding there. It isn't about assessing learning in order to be able to do something about the results. It's an accountability measure, and some might argue an important one, but you would take this as a test and give it to a 14-year-old, and the child would fail it, and then they would say to the government, this test is based on grade 4, 10-year-old material, 14-year-olds are failing it, what are you going to do about it? And so the purpose is very different. It's an accountability measure rather than an assessment of learning per se, because there's not much you can learn about what to do with the assessment. And of course, the last one, TIMS, is an international assessment, which again isn't necessarily tied to any curriculum, but there are items that are agreed across countries. So again, it's an issue of purpose. But I just thought I'd make this point about purposes.
Yes.
Clear, because this is a huge problem with the...
And I'm glad you did, because we'll actually be coming to with the ASSA tool, which of course is what I'm focusing on given our research partners. They're actually trying to think about different ways to use it, beyond the simple accountability, having a number of children who can or can't do it. But thank you, yeah.
I was actually going to say more or less what David was saying was in response to what one of the comments was about it's not really assessing what children may know from their intrinsic knowledge working in a tailor shop or in a market or something like that about math. But it's with all of these assessments, the question is always, what are you trying to measure? And with ASSA, it's not, as you said, it's not trying to measure your ability to work or play with numbers. It's trying to be able to say, you're 10, have you passed the standards we expect at your age for you to have passed, yes or no? And yeah, as an accountability tool. And I think also, though, the fact that ASSA is done in the community rather than in the classroom marks it as being something, that's something quite interesting to think about as well, because they're not trying to target kids in the classroom, so you can get maybe out-of-school children in as well and assess just what very basic skills.
Thank you. Any other comments? Or? Okay, well, thank you. So yes. So it's very useful to get your thoughts, and there are some areas which I think there are many people in the room who have more expertise than I do, actually perhaps have given a little more nuance of thought to some of these elements of collection analysis and actually the purpose of these assessments. And so it's going to be fun to see what you think of the fact that this one particular assessment, the ASSA tool, which was this one right in the centre, the way that this is actually very much at the core of this research and at this initiative that we're trying to understand and trying to study. In terms of implications for data collection and data analysis, I just thought I'd mention two things. And firstly to say, I'm going to be very much focusing on these ASSA assessments, and just to make the point that according to ASSA's own research, which is done at the national level in India, around about 48% of Year 5 students can read this text. And we can talk about what the implications of that, what should be done about that. I'll be sharing with you what ASSA thinks should be done about that in just a few moments. But I'd say that this assessment this particular assessment, the ASSA tool, so the one in the middle of the ones that I was sharing with you, I think has a number of key implications. One we actually already touched upon in terms of data collection, which is yes?
Sorry, can I just ask, that previous slide, is that a translation of what they were asked to read?
Yes. So this is a translation. So this assessment was done in, I think, about 20 languages around India. Of course, depending on how you judge linguistics, language. There are many more. There are many.
We had a speaker last week who was explaining that some of the alphabets or the lists of characters for some languages in India are much more complex or much more difficult than English.
Definitely.
So that was just something going through my mind when you mentioned this, that it may appear simpler to us than it does to someone learning a more complex language structure. I don't know.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's when I think assessment of learning gets very, very interesting, because we've already spoken about a few different dimensions of what we actually mean when we're assessing learning, and the extent to which you can actually compare learning across different languages, across different scripts, is very, very tricky, and especially in such a diverse country as India. You're right. So just to be clear, this is often in about 20 languages, which of course you can say is still exclusionary given the range of linguistic diversity in the country of India. But yes, no, this isn't done in English. This is done in what the assessors believe is the child's native language. And as Bronwyn already mentioned, one very important thing I think about these ASSA assessments is the fact that they're actually done in households instead of in schools. So one idea behind this assessment is that it's quite a lightweight tool that you can take into a household, sit down with a child and complete within about 5 to 10 minutes. And just to give you a sense of why that matters, if you go into rural Pakistan, and if you were only to do assessments of children in school, you'd actually be getting around about 90 to 95% of the wealthiest boys and girls, which is a pretty high response rate. But if you looked at the poorest boys, you'd only be getting about 75%. And if you looked at the poorest girls, you'd be getting just around about 60% or so of those children, if you were only doing the assessment in schools. And just to give you a sense of why this matters, it's not simply enough to presume that the poorest children who are in school are learning at the same rates as the poorest children who are out of school. If you take those poorest girls, the girls in the poorest quintile in rural Pakistan who are in school, at age 12, around about 50% of those children can do basic subtraction, which of course is a shame. But things are much, much worse if you look at those poorest quintile of girls who are out of school. They have next to no chance of having these basic literacy and numeracy skills. So to me, this is a very important element of assessment, a very important part of policy, and a very important part of any kind of action or intervention that we do. You have to be taking account of children in the household, thinking them according to the children in the household, not simply the children that are actually showing up and making it to school. And then, so of course, so I've just tried to touch briefly upon then some of the ways that we're actually trying to use assessments to tell whether or not children are learning. And then another key question, of course, is how we can actually help to address these inequalities between more and less advantaged children in their learning outcomes. And I think one of the key things that really sort of a defining point of this particular assessment and of this particular research initiative is, as I mentioned already, is the idea that the assessment itself can be an important tool. One of the main reasons I think this is the case is because it's actually done in the household. So I've actually seen these done in rural Uttar Pradesh. And one of the things that really struck me is that families are fascinated by these assessments. They really enjoy watching them, and it kicks off incredible debates to the extent that it actually gets quite aggressive and can actually be, I think they actually have quite interesting implications for the fact that families can get very emotional and very upset when they find out that their child isn't able to read a word or able to do sentences at a very, very basic level. But one thing that I think makes this assessment particularly interesting is we've spoken a little bit already about how it's more rudimentary in some aspects. But another thing I think that's potentially quite powerful about this particular assessment and that can really make it a tool potentially for change is the fact that it's very, very intuitive. I saw these done in households where the parents had never gone to school, the parents couldn't read and the parents couldn't recognise numbers. But intuitively they understood whether or not the children were getting these functional skills. And because of this intuitive understanding of things, that's why ASSA, at least through their current research and through their current initiatives, believe that this assessment tool in itself can be a tool in actually bringing about action, bringing about change and bringing about accountability. Okay. So I'll just pause at this point then. So that was an attempt to give you a very sort of basic background of learning assessments at the primary school level globally, and how we've come to and how ASSA have come to develop this particular assessment tool and how they think it's useful. Does anybody have any sort of questions, clarifications, anything at this point?
Can I just ask
Yeah.
one then, which is always something that puzzles me about ASSA, and I love their work as well as the ways that people who do some of the things.
Yeah.
But the one thing that's always puzzled me is just the logic of, I mean, household assessments are great and you can learn lots from them and long may they live in a sense. But is there a sort of logic that says, if a child is in school at the age of 12, and I take the point about the slides, you're probably going to get the wealthiest groups are in school and the poorer groups are out of school. But I'm still not clear about the logic of assessing an out-of-school child on school-based and school-focused instruments. It's clear that a child, wealthy or not, I mean, of course, the dimension of poverty is really important. But if a child is in school and learning, even though slow, they would clearly outperform a child who is not in school and not learning in a school-focused way. But it seems extraordinary that we should be asking children out of school whether they are learning things that have a focus in school, textbooks and teachers and so on. So I'm still puzzled just a little bit about that logic. I can understand the importance of trying to work out from an equity point of view. For me, the question, are all children learning, would be the poverty dimensions within schools, even though there are not as many. But anyway, I don't know. Is there
Sure.
what does ASSA say?
So I might completely misrepresent them, but I think in terms of the logic of doing the assessments, I think it's partly to keep the focus in global policy debates, to make sure that children who are out of school are accounted for. Because you're absolutely right, it might almost seem nonsensical to test children who are out of school on things that they should be learning if they're in school, and which a lot of children who are in school aren't even getting. I think one thing I would sort of come back to is when we talk about PISA, for example. What you're saying is absolutely true. It might seem nonsensical to assess children after school, but if they're not included in the data, it amazes me how readily people can get to assessment and policy debates that use only in-school assessments and use those to try and formulate policy. To give you one example would be PISA, and there are still claims about some countries in PISA do phenomenally well. One example would be Vietnam, and that often completely misses the fact that that's assessing children who are in school, and by age 15 or 16 many children are out of school. And if you compare two countries on their performance of children who are in school, you might be massively misrepresenting the gulf actually in performance between them if one has only 50% of children still in school, one has 95%. I'm just fishing in my head right now for the researcher. I think it's Nick Spall from South Africa has done a lot of research on this recently to sort of just to make the very, very simple point that you have to keep including the children out of school. I think the other key reason that it matters is because many of these assessment groups, such as ASA, UWEZO, ASA Pakistan, they're increasingly moving towards action, and they're increasingly trying to do it at the community level. We can get into political economy analysis, but often they're trying to work outside of the school system, and they're still trying to work in communities and trying to work with the children who are out of school. That's quite a partial answer to your question, but hopefully that gives some. Thank you.
Can I?
Oh, yeah.
One other thing, I did my DPhil fieldwork in India, in communities like this, and one of the sort of notable features was that children serially dropped out and re-enrolled, and particularly those who were relying on budget private schools.
Yeah.
If the price went up, they'd drop out for a few months until they were able to raise the cash. So I wouldn't say that children who are in school and children who are out of school are two simple categories.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it was the Young Lives survey, I don't know if anybody's more familiar with that than I am, that found that some children had gone through 6 to 8 budget private schools, by the time they were about 10 years old, because the parents kept shifting them sometimes to cheaper and cheaper, and sometimes to more and more expensive, depending on how the family finances were going. That one financial shock could mean that a kid, was out of school for 6 months and then possibly re-enrolled if they were lucky. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's I think that's a very interesting thing to speak about, especially in relation to India, because in India they have a national policy that children move through the grades quite simply, and as you're saying, that's not the case in terms of moving through school. Children often jump around schools, they're often very price sensitive, especially in areas with a lot of private schools. I've been working on another research project on early childhood education, and actually, what we're seeing there is more than 60% of the children in rural India go to more than one kindergarten, and about 60% of them actually move backwards or get held back at least 1 year. In the earlier, so you're right, it gets very, very messy very quickly, and perhaps talking about them as two static groups, even that's misrepresentative, yeah.
I was just wondering about who's being held accountable for these things, because you said, well, you bring these tests to homes, and it can be like a quite problematic scenario in which parents, for instance, react really angry when they see that, it turns out that children are not able to do these sorts of tests, either because they're out of school or even within school. So the idea, I'm just wondering if I get this straight. The idea is to raise awareness of the gravity of the problem within communities, therefore the household services, in order to then assume that those communities will be able to have some sort of agency to change this on a policy level. That's the idea. No,
I wouldn't say so. But you're getting very much at the core of what I'm hoping to speak about in the next part, which is how the intervention is defined. I think it's a challenge with a lot of these assessments. So as I'm going to say in a moment, these assessments are done in about 15 countries now. And I think what you're bringing up a very important and problematic point, which is that many of these countries seem to be assuming that if they do the assessments, change will come. And if parents know that their children are...
Who has the agency, and is this the harm that's been done by virtue of, for instance, are the children being held accountable for this? The teachers, on which level is the criticism targeted here, and who is really hold accountable for this? So what are the kind of ethical implications of, for instance, home surveys that portray the limitations of knowledge of those children?
There are lots of ethical implications, and I was very concerned when I saw the assessment done that it would be quite shaming for children. At least the assessors I saw seemed to be very sensitive to this, and I feel like they did it in a way that was not shaming for the children. Yes, I mean, you're essentially getting at the core of the problem, which is what do you do now and who is to be held accountable? And again, I might be misrepresenting our Indian colleagues, because they're the ones that are very much designing the intervention, but I think their main focus would be on helping the schools to be more accountable to children rather than the government. I'll speak about this in a little more detail in a moment, but essentially the teachers right now are required to get through the curriculum, to present a certain amount of material through the year, and not necessarily to be held accountable for whether or not children are learning. But it gets a lot stickier than that, very simplistic, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But, yeah.
I'm a bit confused. So the project looks at school accountability, but then you measure out of school kids. Does that help you, to have a benchmark to see the added value of schools? Do you use the out of school, do you use them to measure the added value? I just don't understand. So if it's a project on school accountability, you're basically measuring home accountability. I'm not understanding the logic.
Yeah, it's very much in the nascent stages. We're still arguing about exactly how to do this. We still haven't actually decided which state of India we're going to work in, and whether we want to focus on a state that has where 95% of the children in government schools. In which case, so what I've just shown you actually in a sense might be misleading, because I was focusing on the idea that you have to get children out of school for all sorts of reasons. For this particular intervention, because it's school accountability, we're probably actually going to go in a slightly different direction and just focus in areas where almost all of the children are in the particular schools. And so doing the assessment at the household level maps very well onto the school. There are all sorts of ways that you can use the assessment, I think, to focus on children out of school, to think about very, very different interventions to what we're doing here. So in a sense, maybe I've actually thrown a bit of a curveball. I've taken things off in a different direction by talking about the importance of assessing children who are out of school. Because in this one, you're absolutely right. We want to think about what teachers are doing, what's happening in schools. So we're looking to focus on areas where actually that maps on very, very closely. The children that we assess at the household, making sure that they're in the same schools.
Okay, I get it now.
Okay.
I was going to say exactly what our colleague said, which is just because they're not in school that day doesn't mean they're not in school. Full stop. But I'm just mindful of your time.
Okay, sure. Sure.
I just want you to get into some of the meat.
Sure thing. Sure thing. Just to be clear, this question is just asked of the parents. Is the child in school and which school are they in? It's not done on whether the children are actually in school on the particular day. But even then, that's a very, very messy thing with a lot of dynamics. But yeah.
I was just going to say, on the level of accountability, the 3 villages that I did my fieldwork in Rajasthan had a total of 9 schools in. I was there for 5 months. There was literally never a teacher present in any of the 9 schools throughout that 5 months. There were older pupils looking after classes of younger pupils, and occasionally there were sort of big sisters all at administrative ear, and you saw classes of children sort of sitting chanting the alphabet and chanting times tables with close to zero comprehension of what they were chanting. But the parents and their children's lack of comprehension was directed almost entirely at absentee teachers, who were just literally not there for months on end in rural schools.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so turning then to the nature of this particular intervention. So what we're focusing on here is the idea that the title of our intervention is the idea that it's going to focus on accountability from the grassroots. But before touching upon the village level, I think it's important to note that ASSA is actually part of an international collaboration, which is what you might call what is called a South-South initiative. So it's a group of research partners that are initially from the South and that are working across the global South with one another, and now with quite a considerable global reach. These are members from across the many different countries that are now part of this network, which is the PAL network, the People's Action for Learning Network. And these different country teams, they're typically NGOs, sometimes based in universities. I think one of them is a for-profit group, which is in Nigeria. Do these sort of similar sort of assessment levels of foundational skills. These are just 4 examples from, I think, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And these different assessments, so these different country teams have tried to sort of find a sort of a synergy in the way that they do these different household assessments, so as to bring about a broader evidence base that's very much from the South, that's speaking very clearly about foundational skills for children. But this network is now increasingly interested in action. And the main way I think that they are focusing on, the main logic through which they believe that we can help to improve things is through more of a focus of teaching at the right level. And teaching at the right level for the PAL network and for these different countries, including ASSA, follows a very simple logic and uses these sort of quite foundational assessment tools as quite sort of a simple, lightweight way of making sure that children are learning at the right level. So at a very, very basic level, the idea is that you group children into 5 different groups. You have the children that are unable to read letters, those that can do words, those that can do sentences, and those can do stories. And on that very simple basis, you put them into 5 main ability groups, and then you focus the teaching according to the level of the child. This is seen, as I mentioned already, this is seen amongst ASSA and in India as a particularly important and sort of just a very, very simple, perhaps simplistic way of doing pedagogy, but seen as very important because right now in India, there's a national need, there's a national focus on teachers are required to make sure that they get through the curriculum in a given year. They have to get through all of the material, and the material is often done at a very, very, not often, it is done at a very high level to the extent that by the end of grade 2, most children should be able to do this, but as we know from the assessments, only about 20 to 30% of them can, which leads to many getting left behind. Now, I'm not sure if you've had any talks yet about Lant Pritchett. Lant Pritchett is sort of the leader of the RISE initiative, which is probably the major, again linking to DFID and to DFID's research initiatives. Perhaps the largest sort of systems level educational research. I don't know how much it fits into the ESRC-DFID. We're quite.
They're
twin, okay.
So yes, it's a different funded project as well. This is sort of another take on it, isn't it?
Okay.
We it's sort of not far away at the Blavatnik School, and so we have a similar interest in systems, but there's not enough coherence. But I mean, it's something we'll pick up in our discussion in London. But yeah.
Great. Okay. So to give you a whistle-stop tour on sort of Pritchett's approach to what's going wrong in education systems, he talks a lot now about coherence or incoherence, and basically the idea that what a community or what people want schools to do in terms of providing education is not necessarily the same thing as what they ask the governments to do or what the governments ask schools to do. And if you just think about this in a very simplistic way in India, you've got the government telling the schools that what they need to be doing is completing the curriculum in any given year. And that sort of, if you like, that drowns out what communities might want, which is for children to be actually raising their learning or their literacy outcomes. So you've got to focus on curriculum completion instead of whether children are actually learning. And whilst we still haven't fully developed this intervention, the hope is that it's going to lead, when we were talking about the logic of how change will happen, the hope is that it's going to help communities to actually have more of a voice, both in speaking directly to schools about what they want, and also ideally leading to some more activation through whichever political mechanisms they're able to get more of a focus onto the government in terms of focusing on learning outcomes. Very, very ambitious. Whether it's going to happen is another thing, especially since we're still thinking about what the intervention is actually going to be. Yeah.
Are there any sort of follow-up support systems by the same organization that's prompting those tests in terms of, for instance, providing knowledge of how to address the government or how to address the school? Are there any sort of guidelines that those parents would be able to use in order to delegate?
The bit about how they actually work with schools is the thing that we're working on right now. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of helping them to think about how to mobilise with the government, I'm not so sure, to be honest. I think that's happening more in some of the other countries that I mentioned. I don't think that's the primary focus of ESRC India, but they might think that I was misrepresenting things. And so the main initiative that ESRC India have been doing so far to try to sort of think about strengthening this link between communities and the actual schools that are taking place is through an initiative called, excuse my pronunciation, La Cormeec, which essentially means 1 in 100,000. And the idea here is that you use these quite simple assessment tools to provide information at the village level and to get people talking to each other. So you do the assessment at the village level, and then the idea is that the village gets together, has a meeting, and actually fills out something along these lines. So they talk about which village they are. They actually note down the numbers of children within the village who are able to read a story, able to do a subtraction. And the idea is that this actually starts to bring people together and actually starts them to get speaking to one another about these assessment levels and actually speaking in quite a concrete way about what children can and cannot do. This is then paired with activities the idea is that it can help the children to actually lead to more change. So it can help the communities to actually enact more change. And I won't go into the details now, but this is driven by research coming out of MIT, the J-PAL group, who did randomized controlled trials and found that if you give families information about what their children are learning in rural India, that's not enough. You have to give them tools. And so the essential tool is that that people come together initially to talk about the learning levels, and that you then start to group them, as you can see in number 2, according to these different ability levels. The idea is that there is then child-to-child support, and also children working with each other and adults working with them in order to bring about greater learning from these very, very basic levels. But if you put the children together on the right level, you then have particular materials. ASA provides some materials, but you also have them doing activities together. The hope is that they can then help to get up to the next particular level. These tend to take about 30 to 50 days. I won't go too much into the details here. I'm not an expert on it anyway, but I can speak about it more if that's of interest to you. And these have been done right across the country of India already. It was called 1 in 100,000 because they were targeting 100,000 villages. It actually took place, I think, in about 150,000 villages so far. So that's basically one of the interventions that we're going to be thinking about, which is what happens if you get communities together. They start to understand where the children are learning. They speak about it with one another, and you give them these very, very simple ability grouping assessments. Ability groupings, and then you have them do learning tools together for 30 to 50 days. When you were asking me earlier about the logic of what we're doing, I don't actually know yet. That's very much what we're debating right now, and I'm very much trusting our colleagues in India because they're the experts. They've been doing it for over a decade. They're very much practitioners too. But they're starting to think about the ways that you can actually involve school actors. And one of the main key ways is the idea is that you're going to be bringing teachers and school leaders more into these particular meetings. And the hope is that you're going to be involving them more in the learning for children of what's happening outside of school. So that's essentially the black box of treatment 1, which we were arguing about what to call it. Lakon Mayek is LME. And so far, as I said, it's very nascent, so we haven't got yet beyond LME plus as our treatment 1. And I now realise that might be the copyright of Dropbox, but yeah, a black box, so we don't actually know what we're doing yet. So I'm sorry that I'm actually in a sense sort of being quite evasive about what the intervention is. That's because we don't actually know yet. So any thoughts, any comments on that would be very, very interesting, as we're still actually just figuring this out. Yeah, so I guess I'll just pause then. Any further comments on the interventions, or yeah?
But when you go to the household, you will ask the students, the family, whether the kid goes to school, I guess.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yes. And we're still choosing the states. And at one point we were thinking about doing Uttar Pradesh, because that's one of the states with the lowest learning levels in India, I think. But one of the challenges there is I think you have about 50% approximately now of children going to private schools. And the idea is that the hope is that this is going to help to build accountability within government schools. And so we're now thinking, I think we're either Bihar or Odisha is going to be the main focus. And yes, the idea is that it's going to map on very closely children, whether or not they're in the schools, and we'll definitely be finding that out. Yeah.
Just a question about just thinking about the opportunity cost of schooling and the value of literacy. And I mean, I wouldn't know about this, but is it conceivable, for instance, that some parents that might have the same level of knowledge with regard to literacy as their children might not be that outraged about realizing that their children have those limitations? Maybe they don't think it's that important, or even if they do, maybe the outrage is not transformative enough to cause action. So are there any other ways, despite for instance, those home assessments, in order to somehow raise the awareness that this might be a problem? And I mean, I wouldn't know, but I just don't think that it's completely inconceivable that the problem is well known, that communities are aware of the fact that their children might not be as literate as they should ideally be. They might know their own limitations of literacy, yet it's not the most salient thing in their society at that point. I wouldn't know, but I'm just assuming so. In the context of these sort of interventions, any sort of measurements that engage with this possibility?
Sorry, it's like you want to respond.
I think, from my understanding, it's for what you're doing is an intervention that gives the village a measure of the level of literacy and numeracy based on what they should be learning at school. So those tests, those ACER tests, they should be learning that at school, but at the moment the issue is they're going to school. There's lots of children, there's issues there, and so hopefully this is a tool that they can then use to leverage some kind of change. Now it might not be the total tool, but it gives them some data. So even though they might know that their kids aren't literate, this is across the state, if all the villages are coming and the village leaders are asked, your schools are really good, yes, you've got lots of kids in school, yes, except in our village there's 60% of kids that are only at level 2, and this is what we're trying to do. I assume that's what you're doing.
Thank you. That's a very clear, concise summary of what we're doing. Thank you. Yes, thank you. But sort of to come to this question, I think you're touching upon a few interesting different points. One is whether or not the parents already know whether their children are learning. I can only give you anecdotal information, and my experience is that they don't. As I said, when I saw this done in households in Uttar Pradesh and in rural areas, the parents seemed absolutely shocked. Whether or not the parents are then worried about whether their children are learning, I don't know. Again, I'm no expert on that, but my general feeling would be that aspirations are pretty high even in rural India for learning amongst children. My main concern about inequities amongst families is what they do with that information and how readily they can actually support their children or know what to do about it, which is why I think this is quite interesting, because again, it's quite simplistic, but it's actually giving quite tangible skills to a village or a community to actually lead to change. One of my strongest memories of another piece of field work was going into rural Tanzania, and the idea was that communities could solve problems for themselves. And one thing that happened there was there was a local parent-teacher association, and they tried to decide what they were going to do with some funding they got from an NGO about children who weren't in school. And their solution was to build a prison and to put the parents in jail for those if they were the parents who weren't sending their children to school, which I felt was which to me seemed like an extremely counterproductive and not at all what you should be doing, but perhaps seemed like quite a logical thing to do in a particular context. So one thing I feel is quite strong about this is there are some concrete. Sorry?
Did it work?
The prisons.
Yeah.
The NGO jumped in to stop them from doing it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was also quite interesting, thoughtful ideas from this same. It was fascinating seeing what different communities came up with. Another was sort of quite was a loan-based system in which parents could take out loans, but then it had extremely high interest rates and very, very punitive demands on families who weren't able to meet the loans, which again led to all sorts of interesting and very, very difficult ethical dimensions. And the NGO actually weighing in and then saying, actually, maybe we shouldn't give as much freedom as we have with the funding and the support we did. Yeah.
Just going back to what you're saying about picking a state.
Yeah.
I believe that since the right to education legislation came in 2010, states have had different responses to whether they enacted the bit about private schools having to take 25% of students paid for by the government. So one way of looking at which state to choose might be to pick one where actually the private schools do have to take 25%. Of non-personally fee-paying students, because actually it would be a genuinely interesting category for your study, would be whether the non-fee-paying 25% are achieving as well as the fee-paying 75% in private schools, and how that compares with your interest in the government schools.
Thank you. I'd thought that. Yeah, yeah. Because we've just been thinking about whether there are lots of private schools or not, but maybe a more interesting one is to what extent are private schools actually accountable to the broader population, especially. Yes, with a batting alley. Yeah, thank you.
I was going to ask a question about whether there are materials given to the families when they come to their homes. So when I was involved in ESRC some number of years ago, the first iterations of it were that the test was given and the children did or didn't do well, and then the testers left. And the idea was, well, maybe we should give some materials so that parents can work with their children, so we can encourage at the same time as we give the test to say, here are some extra materials you can have with this test, And I wondered whether that was carrying on. At that time, the idea was good to give materials. Implicitly, people will get more engaged because they'll be equipped with this new information and these new materials. So we assume that they're going to get more engaged, and then the 10-year review was like, oh, actually, they didn't really get engaged. So I'm wondering now that the emphasis is turning on to how do you engage them and actually turning that into action, the data they're drawing on. Are they still giving materials in homes, and is that part of the intervention as well? That they're not just focusing on how to push that accountability button, but also how to push that parental involvement in their learning at home.
So if you've got ASA, the assessment, which is just they do go in and assess children, and then you've got the intervention, which uses the assessment. My understanding is now with the assessment, they do not leave learning materials at all. That's my understanding. But with this intervention, the idea is very much that there will be learning materials, different reading materials at different levels of interest for different storybooks, whatever it might be. My understanding is that those will be very much something that are given to the communities and that hopefully children will be using in their households. Yeah.
Just to echo what you were saying, I think to me a lot of the world can be understood in terms of incentives, and unfortunately what I'm beginning to perceive is that in our Western institutions we tend to want to focus on the government because it's scaled the fastest.
Yeah.
So someone like ASA, if they can get into government schools, it will mean they can get a government contract to say let's roll this out all the way through, or for academics, and let's face it, there are incentives there too. The scale is going to be much better if you can do something that's in the public sector where someone will find budgets to push things further along.
Yeah.
And I think that misses the point that in a lot of the developing world, the sharp end is in the private sector. People are skipping the government because they know the government is dysfunctional, because they know that the incentives, for example, for teachers working with the government isn't to teach, it's to collect the government salary.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real struggle in this, is that idea of, well, what is the teacher's incentive structure? And I was a teacher, so I'm not keen on this idea that you measure teachers based on everybody passing, because, well, with the wrong incentive structures, everyone manages to pass just fine. No matter how you design the test, the teacher just finds a way to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, yeah.
But that doesn't change our underlying problem, which is you've clearly got families who are desperate for their children to learn. We know that India has a high value placed on education. They know that education their kids one ticket out of having the same life that they have.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they don't have much power at all. And it's interesting that what you are hoping for is motivation from them to the government. I'm not sure that their relationship with the government is in any way functional enough, no matter how angry they are that the teacher doesn't pitch up, or that the teacher isn't teaching their kids what they should be learning, or that their kids, for whatever other reason, aren't learning what they should be learning.
Yeah.
It's not an easy one to unravel, that thing of not getting the job done from the top, but at the same time not necessarily having the power from the bottom to be able to ask that that job be done. I mean, I've been trying to go through that in my own mind for South Africa. Should we be saying there should be a basic capability pass, at which point, particularly in rural areas, if children reach it, they can go back to work for their parents, or the government could even incentivize parents by giving them some kind of, the basic income grant would be linked to a slight bump up as soon as your child reaches a certain literacy benchmark. I don't know. I mean, it's just, now that would be a financial incentive for the child, which is probably not fair on the child, but on the other hand would make the teacher extremely accountable, because the parents would lose money if the teacher didn't do their job. Yeah. It's a very complicated problem, because you've got the three parts you showed in the triangle, and they're all in it for their own, take of whatever the pie is, or what they can get the most of while giving the least.
Yeah, you're unpacking a lot of massive and very, very interesting elements, which is, and just to pick up on one, should you be focusing perhaps more on the private sector? I think that's a really interesting one, because to me, that in the research I've done so far in the private sector, especially in rural India, there are two sides to it. One is that they might be more, one is that you've got this thing of perhaps more responsiveness to parents' needs. Arguably, in terms of teachers showing up, teachers being held, teachers potentially being let go if they're not doing the right thing. Another element I think that's really fascinating about the private sector in rural India, at least in what I've seen so far, is that they again being more responsive, and they're actually providing parents with what they think is good education, which isn't necessarily the case. Which will often be the case in some of the research I've done. It's focusing on the idea that even at the very in the kindergarten level, you have a lot of low-fee private kindergartens in rural India, which say that they're teaching English. Of course, they're often not, because the teachers can't really teach in English. All of the cognitive psychology research I think we have would argue that you shouldn't be doing that for children who don't have any other stimulation with English and it's not a native language. They're doing very, very strict physical discipline for the children, making them sit in rows, making them look at the chalkboard, because that's what the parents think a good education looks like. They think if they go in and see the children sat down and something written in English and the children get smacked, that's what they think is good. And it leads to all sorts of difficult things in terms of incentive structures, the financing, what schools are actually doing according to parental demand. And in a sense, I'm sort of dodging your question again, because yes, the focus here is very much on the government sector. Even in India, that's more, every year that they do these assessments, more and more children going to private schools. When I showed you that full PAL network, that global network, one of the most interesting countries there arguably is Nigeria, because they're taking quite a different attitude, which is, especially in urban Nigeria, if we want to work with the most disadvantaged children, we have to engage with and work with the private sector. And they're doing some quite interesting things there. But sorry.
A little bit on the side note, but in terms of intervention, is there any aspect of this whole project that takes into account maybe the social status of the teachers in those communities, and if there are people, because you just said there are so many circumstances under which teachers just don't show up at schools, for instance, and I don't think it's inconceivable that this might be related, for instance, to the cultural capital you have when you are a teacher, for instance, and like social attitudes that comes with being a teacher. So maybe it would be interesting to kind of draw out, well, what are the parental attitudes towards teachers, and how is it probably possible to raise the motivations of teachers to, become more invested in those children, or to work closer with these communities, if probably the promise is not some sort of more money or anything like that, but more kind of social recognition in a way, and maybe there would be incentives or intervention programs that could target those heightening the social recognition of teachers.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at a really big point, and this is something that we're still trying to unpack with this intervention, because what we're hoping to do is to make it a little bit more holistic. The hoping is that more of the motivations will be intrinsic for the teachers, and in terms of more engagement, more respect in the community, and sort of breaking down what I think has been called in other areas of education the fixed mindset, which is a concern that the teachers just think they've come from a completely different community and they think these children can't learn anyway. This is just a complete waste of my time. There were some quite interesting other teacher incentives that are both in this set of research programs and in the WISE programs, in the WISE program more generally, which focus on very, very different incentive structures. One, for example, in Delhi now they have they're about to put cameras in every single classroom, and that's actually being studied by Kartik, by the India research team for the WISE program, which is a very, very different idea, of course, based on what I would say a lot more stick and a lot less carrot.
But also from the RISE program, there's the work done by STIR, which is on teacher motivation through teacher mentorship, teacher networking.
Yes.
So I mean, it's a very rich field of study, how you motivate and incentivize teachers in many different ways to
absolutely
the classroom and teaching, and happy about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
I know you want to get on to research and design. Whether it's too late or whether you have any sort of influence, I'm slightly deeply worried about the treatment, and of course, your colleagues in India will probably ignore it completely. But there are two things that worry me. One is the distinction you've drawn between literacy and learning, which I think is probably an unhelpful distinction. It's only because any research in reading and certainly language development would suggest that it's, which comes to the second point about profiling kids by sentence, word, and so on. So most research in language development would suggest that actually it is one of the most explosive areas, and it's not unreasonable to expect that. I was giving the example to students the other day about kids in leafy suburbs being pushed around Sainsbury's or so on in a trolley, and just exposure to different cereal packages means that on a Saturday morning they've actually learned 3 or 4 more words than they knew by the time they went out of the house, because they're in close contact with parents, and so they learn colours, they learn words and so on. And I think it's unhelpful to actually profile or group students by those who don't know words, don't know sentences and so on. I think it makes a little bit of a mockery out of many, many decades of creating a learning progression, the kind of thing that's understood about how skills develop, which skills might develop early on. And language development can be really explosive, and some kids just don't learn a single word in 1 year, and then suddenly, within the next month or so, their vocabulary just shoots through the roof. And that may be because of exposure to more books, exposure to parents reading to them, or just candlelight so they can actually read the book that has been by their bedside or something like that. The other point really is the distinction between literacy in the way in which the instrument tries to measure it, reading words, reading letters and so on, which is fine. And the idea of, that we distinguish this from learning. I mean, this is a bizarre example, because I don't think any educational systems do so, but my sense is that it's quite possible actually to teach children to become decent historians of in primary schools, or decent scientists, or decent social studies people, by teaching them through pictures and narratives. So a child might never need to know how to read, but is actually quite good at listening to a story about a historical development, and might actually see evidence of historical battles in pictures or something, and will come home actually, quite comfortably, a historian who's able to retell historical tales or cultural tales and so on and so forth. I know it doesn't happen, maybe it should happen more, but I'm just really worried about this distinction between literacy and the potential for it actually to develop quite explosively within a month or two, and the idea that it's disconnected to a kind of learning trajectory. My advice for parents would be, it's great to kind of keep track of how learning progresses. Dump the idea of profiling them in these ways, but ask the question, how fast are our children learning new words? How fast are they reading more sentences? How fast are they But I think that profiling by sentence and word and so on fills me with dread, I have to say.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to have some interesting conversations today, because I think I should say for the broader audience, this profiling is what I would guess is probably going to be the major move in the next few years. I would guess because MIT, the economics department at MIT, is very much pushing this teaching at the right level model. I think there's a tremendous amount of funding for it internationally. So I'm very interested in hearing more about what you see as the concerns. And partly I would say, I mentioned this PAL network earlier, and I gave you the sort of the glossy version, which is of a very sort of unified group. Some of those countries very much disagree with this profiling. So for example, the NGOs that are based in Mali, they believe a lot in these sort of community-based learning modules, but they don't think that the children should be grouped by according to any disability or anything else. They should be learning together. And again, just very, very briefly in relation to what you're saying about different modes of learning, sort of storytelling, the research group that are coming out of Senegal, they're very interested in using storytelling models that are based in local communities according to sort of local oral histories, local storytelling models, and some quite interesting different ways there too. So I'm going to keep, sorry, was that?
No.
Okay. So I would just run through the research design, but as I've shown you already, we've got an intervention in its very nascent stages, and that's very much true for the research design too, just because we just got together last week for the first time. But the overarching thing I would say is that we're doing mixed methods, although I would say with the considerable caveat that we are putting a major focus on the quant side of the research, and very much on trying to get at what economists would call causality. So we're working from, I don't know how much sort of different research methods different members of this group have done, but we're focusing on what I would call the economics or the econometric models primarily, which is what you might think of as which is named commonly as the Neyman-Rubin framework. And the essential idea here is you're getting a very, very simple but very, very clear model of causality. So if you think you have a given student and you have their outcome, which for us would be the learning levels, and then you want to find out what happens for that student's learning outcome if they do get the given incentive or the given intervention. In order to do that, you would then compare that same student if they didn't get the incentive or they didn't get the intervention. Of course, logically, it's impossible to both give the same student an intervention and to not give them the intervention at the same time. So what you're trying to do instead is to assess what we would call the counterfactual, as in what's our best guess as to what would have happened to this given student if they didn't get the incentive as compared to when they did. I won't go into details, but I can talk a little more if you're interested, but for those who focus on economics and econometrics, there's a very clear pecking order, I would say, in terms of different methods, starting from basic regression models, but then going up to what's typically seen as the gold standard within econometrics. There are all sorts of concerns, I think, with this research method, and we can talk about that if that interests you. But it's very much seen as the gold standard in econometrics is the randomized control trial. And that's what we're trying to do with this particular study. So in terms of the mixed methods, we're firstly primarily starting from a quantitative randomized control trial to try and assess the causal impact of these particular interventions at scale. And then we're hoping to complement that with qualitative case studies, which would be to help us to understand some of the heterogeneity that occurs in different villages. Why might it be that uptake varies across contexts in terms of who does and doesn't take part in these particular community-based initiatives? So the randomized control trial is done at quite a considerable scale. We're going to be working for the main intervention in around about 400 schools, then in the second sort of baseline treatment group in 200 schools, and then in the control group for about 200 schools, with a focus on children in grades 3 through to 5. So I would say I'm a bit stunned that our research partners in India can do that, but they can. That's quite considerable scale for a randomized control trial. The particular outcomes we're interested in are going to be related to learning. Again, the learning, so it sounds like some of you have considerable concerns about the assessment, but the learning is probably going to be tied very closely to this assessment. Children's ability to move up from one level to another. We're going to be going into classrooms, doing classroom observations. We still haven't finalised which particular tools that we're going to be using. Actually, Pauline Rose will be coming in a few weeks to speak with you about another project of hers, where she's done a lot more research. They've used different models of classroom observations. And so we're trying to build on her expertise as to what we might be studying there. And then finally, we're interested in attitudes of school actors, which might help us to get at the mechanisms and to what extent these different initiatives might actually be changing how teachers or school leaders are actually thinking about children and their capacity to learn. The qualitative, we're just going to be focusing in the major treatment areas, because our main interest is actual uptake of the incentives. So we'll be comparing, I think, 8 villages, 4 that have very, very high levels of school actor participation in the community initiatives, 4 that have very low levels. And we're particularly interested in terms of main enablers and constraints for the teachers in relation to motivation. Do they want to change things? Skills, do they have the skills to change what they're actually doing in the classroom? And then finally, agency, because we think that's a very, very important thing. Teachers might want to focus more on children's learning. They might have the pedagogical skills, but they still might have to just simply get through the curriculum from one day to the next and forget all of these things that they might want to be doing, but feel completely unable to. In terms of the fieldwork timeline, we're going to be working across, through to July 2020. The piloting is, as I said, it's still very early days, so the piloting is actually going to be taking place in March time when we think about the different tools that we're using. So if you have any thoughts or any sort of major recommendations, that would be nice to hear. And then we're going to be basically doing these learning assessments in July, March, and then July again. The intervention is going to be taking place later on this year in 2018. But yes, so that's very much a very sort of broad and quite quick overview of the fieldwork, but that's because, again, we're at the early stages. But hopefully that gives you some idea of what we're actually starting to think about and how we're thinking about the research design and the way that we're going to actually analyse this, the research of this yet to be finalised intervention. But yeah, let me stop there. If there are any sort of questions, reflections, anything else that you'd like to comment on in terms of, well, whether it might be this particular the research design. Or if you'd like to go back and sort of maybe go into a little more detail of any of the things that I sort of skirted around and maybe didn't engage with in enough detail so far, either on the background to the study or the particular intervention model that we're using.
I'm just going to say we have 13 minutes only because we were so engaged in all of the
Great.
aspects of it. So just as a heads up as you're thinking about your questions and discussion, that